So, hello everyone. Today we are having our fourth webinar from the cycle Introduction to Logotherapy, and today's topic is Self-transcendence for all. Hope you are having a meaningful journey, and I am honored and happy to welcome Ravi Dr. Shimon Cowan to join our conversation. Thank you.
So, thank you for persisting with me, and here we are at the fourth lecture today. Now, the topic for this lecture is self-transcendence for all. So this is a very important theme, a very important issue to be raised. Now, particularly when we are going to be speaking about universal values, which is a topic which I will focus in most concretely, please goodness, in the next lecture. We have to, if we speak about universal values, then that is a very big claim that there are universal values. And the idea, and not only that, that everybody, one way or another, can come to those universal values without any pre-commitment to religion. So this brings us to the present topic, which is the idea that self-transcendence, which as we mentioned is such a fundamental concept in Frankl's work, is something which is relevant to everybody, relevant even to the person who consciously is unreligious, and that this is and that it can be invoked in everybody. So this is what we're going to be speaking about today. That everybody, so to speak, can get onto the same wavelength, the same trajectory. Okay. Now, in the previous lecture, we explained that the supplementary role of logotherapy in therapy was to help the patient to the discovery of the values which would orient psychotherapy in dealing with his or her psychological disturbance. And in the lectures before that, we noted that Frankl saw self-transcendence on the part of the patient as that which leads to those values. Now, religion, that is to say, a purified and authentic religious experience, constitutes for Frankl the ultimate self-transcendence and the ultimate meaning. He spoke about meaning, he spoke about ultimate meaning. Frankl argues that the human capacity for self-transcendence is in fact the same thing as the innate religiosity, or as he sometimes called it, the unconscious God within the human being. So that's quite a strong statement, the unconscious God, and that this exists within each and every human being. So the question arises, how this innate religiosity can be claimed for a human being when we see that there are believers, but there are also atheists, there are secularists, and there are agnostics. How does logotherapy and self-transcendence relate to them all? Now, the essence of religiosity is the sense that one is a created being, that one has been created and is enlivened by something which is greater than oneself. Create. This goes together with a humility, the sense that one cannot fully grasp, or perhaps not even grasp at all, one's creator. The awareness of the transcendent greatness of one's creator goes together with the awareness of one's own limitedness, one's finitude. The comparison of one's limitedness and with the transcendent unlimitedness of the creator awakens a sense of dependency, I depend upon my creator. All of these, the sense of creatureliness, humility, limitedness, and dependency, are expressions of self-transcendence, especially in a conscious religious context. The sense of one's finitude leads to the sense of the greatness of that which transcends one. Now, self-transcendence can happen to one. In other words, you can grow up in a religious home or community which is experienced in religious self-transcendence. Or one can experience this self-transcendence unexpectedly and involuntarily. There is a saying that in the trenches, we know old-fashioned trench warfare, where the soldiers used to be in dug trenches, and then they would jump up out of the trenches and advance, and build again new trenches. So there's a statement that they're in the trenches, there are no atheists. Similarly, let's say when there is gunfire going over one's head and one is in a trench, nobody's an atheist. Similarly, a crisis such as a divorce, the death of a loved one, the loss of a business, or a car accident might cause an otherwise irreligious person to feel that radical humility, limitedness, and dependency. It is a momentary disintegration of one's ego, of one's normal sense of independence and control, that can bring one into a self-transcending religious experience. Once the crisis is gone and one feels that one has regained control of one's circumstances, that moment of religiosity can disappear. The inwardly religious person, on the other hand, practices and experiences that self-transcendence more steadily, whether in times of crisis or not. Now, the religious feeling of personal limitedness and dependency on something transcendently greater than oneself is not just a subjective attitude, a need, or a weakness. It is substantiated for the religious person by the experience of the awesomeness and the great goodness of, and the sense of deliverance by, the transcendent creator to whom faith reaches out. In other words, faith relates to the believer, faith relates the believer to something which is actually there, namely God. The reality of the human soul which experiences God is tied to the reality of God. For the self-transcending individual who has not yet reached the religious end station of transcendence, there is also joy, strength, and empowerment in the good of serving a purpose beyond oneself, even though one may not call that God. It's a sense of a higher purpose. There are atheists and agnostics who deny or doubt both the soul and God. They too are amenable to self-transcendence. Most non-religious people are not atheists. They have simply not exercised themselves in a religious quest, or have had a minimal religious education, or have not thought about it. Yet, Frankl observes that in the course of psychotherapeutic treatment, many patients come to express an unconscious religiosity. It is there in many people who have not consciously felt it or acknowledged it, and moreover they wish to involve this as part of their healing. They are ready and waiting for self-transcendence. This is the appearance of the unconscious God, as Frankl calls this, the soul or conscience within the human and which drives the quest for self-transcendence. In other words, this, as he calls it, unconscious God, this innate spirituality, whether it's self-aware or even if it's denied, is actually latently present in the human being, and it is awakened by self-transcendence. Now, I want to now talk about the path of self-transcendence. Leads to a very fascinating idea. Now, I've been asked, what if the patient is hostile to the concept of self-transcendence, and specifically to religious sentiments and values? And similarly, what if the value set of the patient and those to which self-transcendence leads are opposed? In other words, we say that self-transcendence has a spiritual destination, but consciously the person is resistant towards it. How can self-transcendence begin? To this, I've answered that all logotherapy asks of the patient is the willingness to hear and answer the question, what does life expect of you? That's all. That's the only thing. That's all that self-transcendence requires as a starting point. What values, relationships, or persons do you see your life as serving? If the individual resists these questions, thinking only about what life owes him or her, then we have a challenge for the therapist. That person is not in a self-transcending mode yet. The therapist must use his or her skills to try to prompt and stimulate the patient to answer these questions. As noted in an earlier lecture, there may be no therapeutic value in the therapist lecturing the patient about values, because self-transcendence towards meaning and value must ultimately be done by the patient, him or herself. The patient should not be asked to affirm a religious belief. And if the patient does express it, and if this, in other words, happens to the patient, as Frankl writes, this is in fact what he would call an act of grace, which occurs to the patient. Now, as mentioned earlier, the act of self-transcendence, even in the atheist, is in fact a manifestation of the soul, because even the atheist also has a soul. The unconscious God, or the unconscious religiosity that actually dwells within the human being. Now, the stages of self-transcendence are stages of emergence of the soul within the person. Excuse me, just 1 minute. For this reason, the logotherapist can sit with an irreligious patient, even a self-declared atheist or agnostic one, because the potential is always there. And the process of self-transcendence can begin at the most basic level without achieving or requiring the final destination of explicit religious consciousness. Now, this is where I think this is an extremely powerful idea. Frankl makes the important point that the self-declared atheist, agnostic, or secular patient who has begun the therapeutic journal of self-transcendence is in fact en route, that is to say, on the path to the destination which the religious person has already reached. This is an amazing idea in my view. The notion that self-transcendence is a path, it is a trajectory. And the consciously religious person is already at the terminus, already at the end station of that point. And that the person who is not consciously religious, or even thinks explicitly in those terms, is in fact on that path, but at an earlier stage of it. And the secular, or the secular individual, is in fact, in this case, once embarked upon self-transcendence, in fact, using a different language from the language of the religious person. And here are some examples of the difference between the religious individual and the as yet non-religious but self-transcending person. When the self-transcending atheist or agnostic examines his conduct, he may say that he's in discussion with himself. He's talking to himself. The religious self-transcending person, doing exactly the same, will say that he or she is praying or placing his or her deeds before God. 2, another example. The self-transcending atheistic or agnostic or secular individual will speak of his or her conscience, whilst the religious self-transcending person will speak of the soul. 3, the agnostic or atheistic person may move to self-transcendence, be willing to ask what life asks of him. The religious person will ask what God wants of him. In fact, they are on, though at different stages of the same trajectory, the same path of self-transcendence. And because, as I mentioned before, it is the same faculty which is working within both of them. In one, it is unconscious, in the other, it is conscious. Moreover, Frankl seems to suggest that as an individual with little religious knowledge or background progresses along the path of self-transcendence, he or she will come to resonate with the universal values transmitted by religious tradition. The religious person consciously knows these values from religious tradition and explicitly resonates with them. The non-consciously religious person who is on the path of self-transcendence also becomes to have an affinity for these same values without any explicit connection to religious tradition. And this is because his or her soul, which naturally resonates with the divinely given values, is in a state of emergence, though it presents simply and neutrally as conscience, not as soul or not as a sense of religious being. Okay, now, how does the logotherapist help the patient? So what we've said before is that this capacity for self-transcendence is there in every individual, and it is essentially one and the same. It has different names and different expressions, but it is essentially the same, and it takes people along the same path. Different stages, different distances along that path, but along essentially the same path. Now, how does the logotherapist help the patient along the path of self-transcendence and the discovery of meaning, purpose, and value? We have noted that the therapist can equally welcome a non or even an anti-religious patient. For as long as patients have some interest in self-transcendence, that is, in questioning or relativizing their own emotions and perceptions, then they are essentially no different from the religious patient whose whole life is ideally self-transcendence. Indeed, the religious patient may also come with flaws in his or her own religiosity, that is to say, in their own self-transcendence. Religious people are also inconsistent themselves sometimes. They are not necessarily perfected or fully honed in their own religiosity, their own self-transcendence. For religion itself can be practiced in a non-transcending way, namely to serve particular interests. In other words, religion can be a veneer. It can just be a cover for a person who is in fact not a self-transcending person. Such religiosity has then been corrupted, and it requires purification. As mentioned before, the logotherapist's task is to guide the patient along the path of self-transcendence. The therapist should not lecture the patient on meaning. The therapist can only lead the patient in the patient's own journey of discovery of value and meaning. From time to time, the therapist may suggest meanings which the patient could find in specific circumstances. But of course, it is up to the patient to accept them. The therapist, however, must him or herself have some knowledge of the moral destination of self-transcendence. For the therapist must be able to rule out a pathological or morally false meaning. This is important. Some of Frankl's critics wanted to accuse him of authoritarian direction of his patients when he led them into areas of proposed meaning. In fact, some such critics whom I saw themselves did not believe in the spiritual faculty in the human being and are or were themselves moral relativists. One who believes in the objectivity of the soul is not bothered by the authority of its moral content, for that is who the person is in essence. Moreover, the discovery of truths does not necessarily mean that we have never heard them before from anyone. Rather, it may have to do more with our own ability to experience and validate now something which we have heard before but never really internalized. Logotherapy as a path of discovery of meaning through self-transcendence requires qualities in the therapist, him or herself. It is required that the therapist be an example of a self-transcending individual. This is very important. The logotherapist must, him or herself, be an authentically self-transcending individual. And this is so for several reasons. One, the therapist cannot coach the patient into self-transcendence if the therapist is not capable of or has little understanding of the self-transcendence that they're meant to impart, to teach the patient. If the therapist does not embody the values, which are the goal of self-transcendence, then the patient cannot see in the therapist the moral destination of self-transcendence. 3, logotherapy is a mentoring relationship. And for this reason, the therapist must stand above the patient in the scale of self-transcendence. 4, self-transcendence requires the living out of values in action, and the therapist needs to model the integrity and consistency of thought and deed. Remember that story I told about Frankl in the concentration camp, when faced with the loss of his own manuscript, he said, okay, now here's the test. Now the test has come to me. I've talked about it. Now I have to be able to be an example of it, that I can continue to live life, even if it seems that life has thwarted my deepest wishes till now. Now, this awareness came to Freud, and the words that Frankl used in that particular case were that he came now to see, he saw the necessity to, quote, live my thoughts rather than simply putting them down on paper. Now, Frankl believed, as we have said, in universal values and meanings. And this has been emphasized by his major student, Elizabeth Lucas. Whether or not the therapist speaks out these values in the course of therapy, he or she must at least know them. These are the values which are found at the destination self-transcendence. Now, it'll be our task in the next and the final lecture, please goodness, next week, to set out these values, to actually detail. Not only from Frankl's work, but also from the source of the spiritual tradition from which Frankl himself drank, so to speak. Before proceeding to the discussion of those values, we need to consider some of the basic requirements for the delineation, for the setting out of these values from a therapeutic point of view. What then are the requirements of universal values of conscience? Now, the first requirement of universal values is that they need to relate to the structure of human personality. One of the most extraordinary statements of Viktor Frankl, which made a profound impression on me, was his statement in an early essay called 10 Theses Concerning the Person, that, quote, he said, "The true discovery of the human occurs in the imitation of God." Now, for me, the amazing novelty of that statement was that this theological statement was in fact a proposition of psychology. What the human imitation of God means is that the innermost spiritual makeup, the essential content supplied by the soul to the meaning faculty, to the noetic faculty of the human personality, is aligned and resonates with the divine. In theological terms, this means that the ultimate human values are aligned with the attributes of God, which are replicated on a human scale in the human soul. More concretely, this spiritual template fills out the categories and dimensions of human personality, which is something which I hope to explain in the final lecture. So also, this divine likeness refers to the freedom which a human being has to know and choose right from wrong, in the human, namely in the human being, namely the ability to actualize the likeness. In other words, the imitation of God means the ability to resonate with divine attributes, divine values, but it also means freedom to come to them, freedom to affirm and to actualize them, against all of the other pressures which exist within the human being, psychophysical organism. Now, the second requirement for the identification of universal values is that, to use Frankl's term, they are crystallized. He says they are crystallized through history. What that means? That history constantly comes back to these values. Frankl spoke here about how all universal values have a spiritual history and source. Those who have the language and the texture of traditional faith have an articulate sense of those values. One of the unfortunate features of modern secularism and secular society is its spiritual illiteracy and ignorance of those values. Nevertheless, most people can find some historical links to past generations in which they will be able to reconnect to those transmitted values. Some speak about the 10 Commandments, etc. We'll talk about that more. Now, the third requirement of universal values is that they indeed do find resonance across a diversity of cultures and faiths. They need to be what we call the common denominator, as distinct from culturally particular values. They are culturally general. They are general to all cultures, or they can find resonance within all cultures. And these are, these are values with which everyone can, in conditions of self-transcendence, identify. From the standpoint of the therapist, this constitutes an advantage. The fact that these are a set of universal values, common denominator values, which the therapist can learn, saves the therapist from the difficult or maybe even impossible task of having to take an individual religious or cultural history of each patient. There's no requirement for the therapist, in other words, to become acquainted with every individual's culture or faith or so on and so forth. And it's all of its specifics, because these are universal shared values which can be understood and can be studied on their own. Now, the fact that these values are universal and non-particular, that is to say, they are not anchored in specific tradition, also appeals to the secular patient. In other words, the idea of the universality and generality makes this appealing to the secular patient, whose religious literacy and tradition is very limited. This person is not required to have had a history of specific ritual or rite and so on. Here are basic core concepts and values which can be assimilated or understood by virtually everyone. They are not encumbered by the specific ritual and practices found in the individual religious traditions. Frankl did set out some of these universal values. The full study of universal values, which is actual theological teaching, also, excuse me. But is also set out. Is also set out in the spiritual sources from which Frankl took his own logotherapeutic model of personality. In other words, Frankl. So what we're saying is Frankl did identify a number of these universal values, but in order we can actually I hope and I propose to actually to go through these in a fundamental source for Frankl's own work. And this, of course, this is the work of the Rabbi Yehuda Lev, known as the Maharal of Prague, and how these values, how these universal values are identified and how they relate to the different aspects of human personality is something which I wish to discuss in the next and final lecture, Universal Values, which I will call Universal Values of Human Conscience. That's what I have to say today. But if you ask me just to crystallize the basic points, they are that the ability for self-transcendence, which exists within every human being, is the product, or is made possible by what religious people would call the actual presence of the soul within the human being, or what Frankl called the unconscious God. There is, in other words, a faculty of self-transcendence within the human being, which is in fact the same as the soul. And this, and further, this is a faculty which exists within every human being, consciously religious or consciously secular. In other words, this is and the task of logotherapy is to activate this faculty of self-transcendence. And finally, what one finds is that once the faculty of self-transcendence has been activated with an individual, whether we're using religious terminology or not using religious terminology, in fact, we find the individual on the same trajectory, the same path, and with a basic shared with an affinity with the ultimate values, which are to be found at the end of that trajectory, the end of that path of self-transcendence, which is the so-called, which Frankl called ultimate meaning, and which is in fact to use Frankl's own words, the imitation of God. Now, this may not be, I think in Georgia, this will get a good reception. In the rest of the world, we have some difficulties. So let Georgia be a world leader in this. That's good and fine. Once the world was once like Georgia, but at all events, we don't have to be ashamed. And we don't have, and as mentioned before, Frankl doesn't require a person to commit to religiosity, to commit to any faith. All that Frankl asks is the person embark upon the journey of self-transcendence. Ask the one question: what does life ask of me here and now? So that's it for now. I'm happy to have questions.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting and deep topic today. And thank you for summarizing all these powerful statements. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.